John Roberts stepped into the community center, instantly struck by the mix of noise and energy from the children bustling around. His visit to the support organization for homeless youth was meant to be brief, a routine check-in as part of his volunteer work. But as he wandered the crowded room, he suddenly felt a pair of eyes on him. Turning, he saw a young girl staring from across the room. Her gaze was intense, almost searching, as if she knew something he didn't. The girl couldn't have been older than 9 or 10, with piercing blue eyes that seemed too old for her small, fragile frame. John's heart gave an unexpected jolt, as if recognizing something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. He walked over, feeling a strange pull. "Hi there," he said gently, bending to meet her at eye level. "My name's John. What's yours?" "Lucy," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with a curious, almost challenging expression. "Why do you look so much like my dad?" John blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Your dad?" he asked, hiding his surprise. "You mean, you think I look like him?" She nodded slowly. "I don't remember him much. He left when I was little. But you remind me of him." John's mind raced. Something about this girl, her presence, her words, was stirring up memories he thought he had buried. It had been years, but now, images of a past love. A face, a voice, a pair of eyes as striking as Lucy's, flooded his thoughts, nearly overwhelming him. He struggled to regain his composure. "Do you live around here, Lucy?" Lucy nodded, shrugging slightly. "I'm kind of around here a lot. I don't live anywhere really," she mumbled, her eyes dropping for a moment. John felt a pang, a deep sadness he couldn't explain. Looking down at this little girl, he felt as if he were staring into a mirror reflecting parts of himself he hadn't acknowledged in years. "Hey, Lucy," he said, forcing a smile. "How about we sit over there? I'd love to hear more about you and your dad." As they settled onto a worn couch in the corner of the room, John couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in a way he hadn't seen coming. Lucy's quiet voice filled the silence as she began to tell him fragments of her story, a story that echoed with shadows of his own past, a story that would soon force him to confront memories he thought he had left behind. John sat on the edge of the couch, eyes fixed on Lucy as she spoke. There was an unguarded honesty in her words that pulled at him, something raw and unfamiliar. She talked about her life, moving from one shelter to another, about the people she met along the way, some kind, others harsh. But her stories always looped back to her father, a figure in her mind that felt more like a ghost than a memory. "He used to take me to this big park," she murmured, her gaze distant, as if the details were slipping from her. "There was this little pond with ducks, and he'd let me feed them. I don't remember what he looked like exactly, but sometimes I feel like I'd recognize him if I saw him." Her voice wavered slightly. "It's weird, right? To feel like that about someone you barely remember?" John's heart tightened. He was about to reassure her, but before he could, Lucy tilted her head, narrowing her gaze at him again. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked suddenly, a hint of defiance in her voice. Caught off guard, John leaned back. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just, you remind me of someone too." Lucy's eyebrows knitted together, a spark of curiosity lighting her face. "Who?" John hesitated, feeling the weight of memories he hadn't visited in years. "Her name was Sarah. She was someone really special to me when I was younger." He stopped, unsure how much he wanted to share. But Lucy's gaze, so intent and expectant, made him feel like he owed her more. "I loved her," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "but we lost touch. I never knew why she left." A silence settled between them, broken only by the muffled sounds of the other children nearby. Lucy, looking unusually thoughtful, glanced at him, as if she were piecing something together. "You know, my mom's name is Sarah too," she said, almost as if testing the words. Watching his reaction, the room seemed to tilt. John felt his pulse quicken, and he forced himself to breathe. Sarah. The name lingered, a fragile connection that felt too unreal to grasp. He could barely find his voice, and when he finally did, It came out rougher than he intended. Do you know where she is now? Lucy's expression shifted, her lips pressing together. She shook her head slowly. She left too, a few years ago. I don't know why, and I don't know if she's coming back. The pain in her words was sharp, like an old wound exposed. John struggled to maintain his composure. So many questions swirled in his mind, but he forced them back, focusing on the one in front of him. Do you have anyone else? Anyone who takes care of you? He asked. She shrugged, looking away. There's people, sometimes, but no one who really stays. In that moment, John felt an ache he couldn't ignore, a deep, unshakable feeling that this little girl was more than just a stranger. Lucy, with her sharp, resilient gaze and heartbreaking honesty, felt like a piece of his own life staring back at him. And the thought that Sarah might be her mother, that he might be standing inches away from a part of himself he had never known, left him shaken to his core. But he couldn't burden her with his suspicions, not yet. He swallowed hard and took her hand gently, feeling the smallness of her fingers in his own. Lucy, he said softly, I'm going to help you. You're not alone anymore. She looked up, and for the first time, John saw the flicker of something like hope in her eyes. John couldn't shake the thought of Lucy from his mind. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of memory and emotion that the young girl had stirred up. Sarah, the love he'd never fully let go of, the one person who had vanished without a trace, taking with her the possibility of a future that had once felt inevitable. And now, after all these years, Lucy's face haunted him, awakening questions he thought he'd buried forever. As morning broke, John knew he couldn't keep pushing the questions aside. He had to find out the truth. He spent the day digging through old boxes, searching for any memento that might connect him to Sarah. The boxes were dusty remnants of his past, filled with photos and letters, things he hadn't touched in years. And there, in an old photo album, he found a faded picture of Sarah, her arm around his shoulders, her wide smile full of life. It had been taken in the park, the same park where Lucy had mentioned feeding ducks with her dad. A chill ran through him. The urge to know more overwhelmed him, so he made a decision. He would go back to the shelter, speak to Lucy, and gently probe into the details of her life. Maybe he could find a way to confirm his suspicions, or at the very least, offer her some comfort if she truly was Sarah's daughter. Arriving at the shelter later that day, John found Lucy sitting alone in the small library corner, leafing through a worn children's book. Her gaze was distant, as if lost in her own world. John approached her quietly, watching as she looked up, surprised but visibly happy to see him. Hey, Lucy, he greeted softly, pulling up a chair beside her. I was hoping I'd see you here. She closed the book and tucked it on her lap. I didn't think you'd come back. John felt a pang, realizing how accustomed she must be to people leaving. Well, here I am, he replied, smiling warmly. Can we talk a little more about your mom? Lucy shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her hands. I don't know much about her anymore, she murmured, her voice barely audible. She just left one day. I waited for her, but she never came back. He could see the vulnerability beneath her stoic expression, the way her small fingers twisted together as she spoke. That must have been really hard, he said gently. Do you remember anything about where she might have gone? Or anyone who might know where she is? Lucy bit her lip, as if trying to pull up memories she'd rather forget. Sometimes, she talked about going somewhere safe, she whispered. She was always scared. I didn't understand it then, but I remember. She always looked over her shoulder, like someone was following us. I asked her once if we could just go home, but she said we didn't have a home. A knot of dread twisted in John's stomach. The image of Sarah, vibrant and carefree, was now replaced with a vision of her fleeing from something or someone, and his chest tightened with worry. Lucy, he began cautiously, when you said I reminded you of your dad, do you know his name? Or anything about him? She looked at him, her expression almost guarded. I only know a little. Mom used to call him Johnny when she talked about him. She said he was a good man. But, she hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to say more. John's heart skipped a beat at hearing the nickname Sarah had once used for him. He kept his voice steady, though his pulse was racing. "But what?" he prompted gently. Lucy looked away, her voice almost a whisper. "Mom said that she had to protect me from him. I don't understand. If he was a good man, why would she say that?" John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Lucy's confusion. Sarah had wanted to protect Lucy from him? The thought was like a blow, contradicting everything he remembered about their love, their trust. "Lucy," he said softly, trying to meet her eyes, "I don't know what your mom was afraid of, but I promise you, I'll help you figure it out. You're not alone in this." She nodded slowly, but he could see the doubt lingering in her expression. Years of mistrust and disappointment weren't so easily undone. "I wish I knew why she left," Lucy whispered, barely audible. "Sometimes I think it was my fault. Maybe I wasn't good enough, or maybe she just got tired of me." A pang of sadness hit him. No child should ever feel that way, and he could see how deeply her mother's absence had scarred her. He wanted to tell her it wasn't true, that he was sure her mother had loved her deeply, but he held back, uncertain of how much he should reveal before confirming the truth himself. "Lucy," he said softly, "I'm sure it wasn't your fault. Sometimes, people leave because they think it's what's best, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else." She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. For a moment, there was a vulnerability there that made John's heart ache. She hesitated before reaching out, slipping her small hand into his, and when she spoke, her voice was almost pleading. "Promise you won't leave too?" she asked. The question hung heavy in the air, more than a simple request. It was a lifetime of hurt and abandonment wrapped in a few words. John squeezed her hand gently, looking her straight in the eyes. "I promise," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, he made a silent vow to himself. He would get to the bottom of whatever had happened to Sarah. For Lucy, for himself, for the love he had once shared, and for the little girl who, in ways he couldn't yet explain, felt like family. The following days, John found himself visiting the shelter more often. He would spend hours with Lucy, sharing stories, listening to her talk about the little things in her life, and watching her cautiously open up in small, tentative ways. But despite her gradual trust, there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes, an instinct to brace herself for the possibility of him leaving just like everyone else. One afternoon, John arrived at the shelter with a plan he had been mulling over. He wanted to take Lucy out, show her a world beyond the cramped walls of the shelter, even if only for a few hours. He was a bit nervous as he approached her, unsure if she would agree. "Hey, Lucy," he greeted with a warm smile. "I was wondering, would you like to go out with me today? We could go to that park you mentioned. Maybe get some ice cream, feed the ducks, whatever you want." Lucy looked up, her eyes widening slightly, caught between excitement and caution. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to believe it. "Really," John replied gently, "if it's okay with you." She seemed to consider it for a moment, glancing around the shelter as if expecting someone to interrupt or tell her no. Finally, she nodded, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through. A short drive later, they arrived at the park. It was a clear afternoon, the kind where sunlight filters through the leaves and a soft breeze makes everything feel just a little lighter. As they walked along the gravel paths, John glanced down at Lucy, watching as her guarded expression softened, her eyes brightening with wonder as she took in the familiar surroundings. They stopped by the duck pond, and John handed her a small bag of birdseed. Lucy knelt by the water, scattering a few handfuls and giggling as the ducks paddled eagerly toward her. For a moment, John simply watched, mesmerized by the way she seemed to come alive, her laughter echoing through the park. It was a sound he hadn't realized he was missing in his life, a small, simple joy that had been absent for so long. After a while, they moved to a nearby bench, and John bought her a cone of strawberry ice cream from a passing vendor. She took it with a shy smile, licking it cautiously, as if savoring each bite. "Thank you," she murmured, glancing up at him. "I haven't been to the park in a long time." John smiled, leaning back on the bench. "I'm glad I could bring you here, Lucy. You deserve to have fun, To be a kid, Lucy's face fell slightly, her gaze shifting to the ground. Sometimes, I don't feel like a kid, she admitted softly. Most of the time, I feel old. Like, I have to be strong all the time because no one else will be. Her words hung heavily between them, each one filled with a depth beyond her years. John felt a knot of sadness and anger twist inside him, frustrated by the circumstances that had forced her to grow up too quickly. You don't have to be strong all the time, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find a reason to believe him. But everyone always leaves, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They all say they'll be there, but then they go away. My mom, she was always scared. She never told me why, but I think it had something to do with my dad. John's heart ached, knowing she was speaking from a place of pain and confusion. A young girl carrying the weight of mysteries that should never have been hers to bear. Lucy, he began, taking a deep breath. I don't know why your mom left, but I promise you, no matter what happened, it wasn't because of you. And I know, you don't know me well, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone in this anymore. She held his gaze, the hope and doubt warring in her eyes. She wanted to trust him, he could see it, but years of disappointment had left their scars. He felt a fierce determination welling up within him, a silent vow to prove that he was different, that he would stand by her even when things got difficult. As the afternoon wore on, they wandered around the park, stopping by the swings and playground. John watched as Lucy climbed up the slide, a small smile tugging at her lips as she felt the wind rush by her on the way down. He encouraged her, cheering her on from below, clapping when she swung higher than the other kids, making her laugh. In those fleeting moments, John saw glimpses of the carefree child she might have been if her life had been different. When it was finally time to leave, John led her back to the car, both of them feeling the heaviness of the day's end. As they buckled their seatbelts, Lucy turned to him, her voice soft. Do you think maybe we can do this again sometime? She asked, her tone hesitant, almost fearful. John nodded, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. Whenever you want, Lucy. Anytime. On the drive back to the shelter, he felt the questions rising again, the urge to learn more about Sarah and what had led to all this. He knew he couldn't push Lucy too hard, but he was resolved to keep searching, to find out what had driven Sarah into such fear and secrecy. And if, in the end, it led him to discover that Lucy was his daughter, he would be ready to face that truth, no matter how it changed his life. As he pulled up outside the shelter, Lucy unbuckled her seatbelt, hesitating for a moment before turning to him. Thank you, John, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. He reached out, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. Anytime, Lucy. I mean that. She gave him a small nod, a hint of gratitude and trust in her eyes. And as she walked back into the shelter, John felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over him. Whatever it took, he would be there for her. Days passed, and John's life became increasingly consumed by the mystery surrounding Lucy and the lingering questions about Sarah. Every visit to the shelter brought more clues and suspicions, but no concrete answers. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but the possibility that Lucy was his daughter haunted him constantly, especially when he noticed small, familiar traits, like the way she furrowed her brow when she was thinking, or the slight tilt of her head when she was deep in thought. It was as if pieces of Sarah and his younger self had somehow come together in this resilient little girl. One afternoon, John returned to the shelter with renewed determination. He had spent hours digging through public records and old photos, scouring for any hint of Sarah's whereabouts or connections that might shed light on her sudden disappearance. But as he entered the building, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was missing something important. Hey, John. Lucy's voice brought him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see her standing at the entrance, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Hey, Lucy, he greeted warmly, trying to put aside his worries. I was hoping to see you here. Lucy hesitated, glancing around before motioning him over. Can we go somewhere private? I need to tell you something. John's heart skipped a beat, but he nodded, following her to a quiet corner of the shelter's small library. The room was empty, filled with shelves of worn books and a couple of old armchairs by the window. Lucy climbed into one of the chairs, folding her arms around herself in a gesture of nervousness. After a moment of silence, she looked up at him, her eyes dark with worry. I found something in my mom's things," she began slowly. "After she left, I kept this box with some of her stuff. I didn't really look through it until a few days ago, but there was this letter. It has your name on it." John's breath caught. "A letter? With my name?" She nodded, pulling a crumpled envelope from her jacket pocket and handing it to him. His hands shook slightly as he took it, the familiar scrawl of Sarah's handwriting filling him with a mixture of longing and fear. Carefully, he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words. "Dear John," it began, "if you're reading this, then I can't be there to explain myself. There are things I never told you, things I had to hide to keep Lucy safe. I'm sorry I disappeared without a word, but I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let them find her, and I couldn't let you be part of this. If you're with her now, please take care of her. She deserves to be safe, to be loved. I'm sorry, Johnny. I wish things had been different." The letter slipped from his fingers, his mind racing with questions. He picked it up again, reading and rereading the lines, trying to piece together what Sarah had meant. Who had she been hiding from? And why hadn't she trusted him enough to tell him the truth? Lucy watched him, her eyes wide, as if waiting for some kind of answer. He looked at her, realizing with a sudden, fierce certainty that the truth he'd been seeking was right in front of him. Sarah had hidden Lucy from him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. But fear of what? "Lucy," he said, his voice unsteady, I think I might be your dad." She didn't move, her expression a mixture of shock and guarded hope. You're my dad?" John's heart twisted at the vulnerability in her voice, the tiny crack in her armor. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "I think so," he whispered. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know about you. But I promise, I'll be here now. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Lucy sat still, as if processing his words. Then, with a sudden, fierce determination, she leaned into him, wrapping her small arms around him. John hugged her tightly, feeling a surge of love and protectiveness that nearly overwhelmed him. This was his daughter, the child he never knew he had, the last connection to the love he'd lost. And he would do anything to make up for the years they'd been apart. As they pulled apart, Lucy wiped a tear from her cheek, looking at him with a new spark of trust. "Do you think we can find out what happened to her? To my mom?" John nodded, his resolve hardening. "Yes," he promised. "We're going to find out everything, whatever it takes." The days that followed were filled with long conversations, piecing together every memory and fragment they had of Sarah. John listened as Lucy shared small details, things her mother had mentioned in passing, people she was wary of, places they had stayed, names she had written down on scraps of paper. Each clue was like a piece of a puzzle, and together, they worked tirelessly to bring it all together. But the deeper they dug, the darker the picture became. John began uncovering whispers of Sarah's last years, stories of her running from one city to the next, always looking over her shoulder. There were rumors of threats, people she had tried to avoid, and mentions of a troubled family history she had never spoken about. The truth was elusive, always just out of reach, but one thing became painfully clear. Sarah had sacrificed her own peace to protect Lucy. One evening, as John and Lucy sat together, exhausted from the day's search, he turned to her, a question lingering on his mind. "Lucy, do you remember anything about the people your mom was afraid of? Anything she might have told you, even if it didn't make sense at the time?" Lucy thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. "She never told me much. She said that there were people who didn't want me to be with her. She would say they were family, but not like the kind of family who loves you. She always told me that our family was just us, that it was safer that way." John felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered Sarah's family vaguely, a tangled web of complicated relationships and secrets, but he had never thought they would go to such lengths, that they might be the reason Sarah had run. the reason she had kept their child a secret. He took Lucy's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "We're going to figure this out," he said firmly. "We're going to get to the bottom of everything." Lucy nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. And as they sat together in the dim light, John made a vow to himself. Whatever darkness lay in Sarah's past, he would confront it, not just for himself, but for Lucy, for the family he had found in the most unexpected of ways, and for the love he had lost but never truly forgotten. John spent every spare moment thinking of ways to show Lucy that he was there to stay. He'd lost too much time already, years he could never get back, and he was determined to be the father she needed, even if it took everything he had. But he knew that actions, not words, would be what proved his commitment. He began picking her up from the shelter regularly, taking her on small outings, nothing extravagant but meaningful. Walks in the park, trips to a nearby diner where they shared milkshakes and fries, or evenings spent at the library, browsing through books and laughing over the silly ones. Over time, the apprehension he'd seen in her eyes began to fade, replaced by an openness he hadn't dared hope for. But Lucy was still cautious, still prone to moments of silence when her guard slipped back up, and John sensed that years of mistrust would take more than a few kind gestures to erase. One weekend, he decided to take a bigger step. It was a cold Saturday morning, and he had a plan that he hoped would surprise her. As they drove through the quiet city streets, Lucy peered curiously out the window, her brow furrowed with a mix of confusion and excitement. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing at him with that small hint of a smile he'd come to treasure. "You'll see," John replied, his own smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's a surprise." A few minutes later, they pulled into a small sports complex on the edge of town. Lucy's face lit up as she spotted the brightly painted sign outside that read, "Community Soccer League, Kids Welcome." Her eyes grew wide, darting between him and the field. Are we going to play soccer?" she asked, almost breathless with excitement. "Well, I figured we could give it a try," John said, trying to sound casual despite his own excitement. "I remember you saying once that you liked soccer, so I thought we could kick the ball around. See if you've got any moves." Lucy grinned, an expression of pure joy that he rarely saw from her. They parked, and he led her out to the field, pulling a brand new soccer ball from the trunk of the car. Lucy took it eagerly, her fingers tracing the pattern on the ball with an almost reverent look. "I haven't played in so long," she murmured, a bit of her usual shyness creeping back in. "I used to play with some of the kids at the shelter, but it wasn't like this." John's heart softened, and he reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be great, Lucy. And besides, I'm here to cheer you on. So, what do you say? Ready to show me what you've got?" A spark of confidence lit up in her eyes, and she took a few steps back, adjusting the ball at her feet. She gave it a firm kick, sending it sailing across the field, and John laughed, genuinely impressed. They spent the next hour kicking the ball back and forth, John playing goalie while Lucy attempted her best shots, her laughter ringing out as she dodged and weaved, her movements growing bolder with each attempt. At one point, she paused, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, her eyes bright and alive in a way he had rarely seen. "I feel really happy today," she admitted softly, almost as if the words were a secret. John swallowed, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. "I'm glad, Lucy. You deserve to feel happy every day. And I promise, I'll do my best to make sure you do." Her smile lingered, but she didn't respond, as if weighing his words. After a few more kicks, she finally looked up at him, her expression more serious. "Do you think my mom was happy, too?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question caught him off guard. He knelt down to her level, his face softening as he tried to find the right words. "I think your mom loved you very much, Lucy, and I think she tried to be happy, but she was scared too. She was just doing her best to protect you." Lucy looked away, her expression pensive, as if trying to reconcile her memories of her mother with the life they were piecing together. "I miss her," she admitted, her voice small, "even if I don't understand why she left. I miss her every day." John nodded, feeling the weight of her grief as if it were his own. "I know, Lucy. and you're allowed to miss her and to feel however you need to feel about it. But just know that you're not alone anymore. You have me." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a hesitant hope, as if she was finally beginning to believe that he meant it. In that moment, John felt a surge of determination stronger than anything he had felt before. He wasn't just going to be there for her. He was going to fight for her, protect her, and make up for every moment she'd spent feeling alone. They spent the rest of the afternoon playing, laughing, and as the sun began to set, they made their way back to the car, Lucy's cheeks flushed with happiness and exhaustion. On the drive home, she leaned her head against the window, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her hand stayed resting in his, her fingers laced with his in a quiet gesture of trust. The next few weeks were filled with more small outings, more soccer games and library trips, and little by little, John felt Lucy's walls come down. She began confiding in him about her life at the shelter, the hardships she'd endured, and even shared memories of her mother that she had kept locked away, too painful to speak of before. And as they grew closer, John felt his resolve deepen. He knew that finding out the truth about Sarah's disappearance was the last piece of the puzzle, the final step in giving Lucy the closure and peace she deserved. And he promised himself that he would find it, no matter what it took. John knew the day had come to finally face the truth. Every small outing, every soccer game and milkshake had brought him and Lucy closer, but the shadow of Sarah's disappearance loomed over them, leaving Lucy in a world of unanswered questions. He had promised to uncover what happened to her mother, and he knew that keeping that promise meant digging into painful memories, ones he himself had avoided for years. But for Lucy, he was willing to confront anything. One rainy morning, John drove 2 hours to a town where he knew Sarah had once lived. He remembered it from a trip they'd taken together, back when they were young and full of dreams, before fear and secrecy had driven them apart. The town had barely changed. A main street lined with small shops, an old post office, and the same library he and Sarah had visited together years ago. He felt a strange comfort here, as if the past were alive, waiting for him to unravel it. John started his search at the town's library, combing through old newspaper archives, looking for any trace of Sarah after she had left him. His heart pounded as he sifted through the records, scanning article after article, until finally, a headline jumped out at him. Local woman and child reported missing after family dispute. The date on the article was over a decade old, but he recognized the photo instantly. It was Sarah, holding a small child with wide eyes and dark hair. He felt his pulse quicken. This was Lucy as a toddler, his daughter. According to the article, Sarah had disappeared shortly after a disagreement with her family. There were no further details, just vague mentions of a dispute and concerns for her safety. John's heart twisted as he read, each word confirming what he'd suspected, that Sarah had been running from something or someone, and that whatever it was had driven her into hiding. Determined to find more answers, he drove to the police station, hoping to access any information related to Sarah's case. He spoke to an officer at the front desk, explaining that he was searching for records about a missing woman from years ago. After some initial skepticism, the officer agreed to help and led John into a small room filled with case files. The room smelled of dust and stale paper, but John hardly noticed. He was focused on finding anything that might lead him closer to the truth. As he sorted through the files, he stumbled upon a folder marked with Sarah's last name. His hands shook as he opened it, reading the report inside. It confirmed that Sarah had been reported missing by her own family and that she had been seen fleeing her family home with a small child, Lucy. According to the report, Sarah had claimed that she was protecting Lucy, though she hadn't disclosed what she was protecting her from. Her family had insisted she was mentally unstable, that her fear was baseless, but the officer's notes reflected doubt, a suspicion that perhaps Sarah's fears had been real. John's throat tightened as he read further. The officer's notes had a line that made his blood run cold. Family insists on custody of child if mother is found unstable. Possible history of threats. The words echoed in his mind, confirming his deepest fears. Sarah had run to protect Lucy from her own family. But from what? And why had they wanted custody of a child they'd never met? Desperate for answers, John left the station and headed to the address listed for Sarah's family home. The house was on the outskirts of town, a large, imposing structure with a gated fence and a dark, looming presence. He hadn't realized until this moment how little he knew about Sarah's family, about the secrets she'd hidden even from him. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. After a long pause, a woman answered, her face aging but unmistakably similar to Sarah's. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cold. "My name is John Roberts," he began carefully. "I was close to Sarah years ago. I'm here about her daughter, Lucy." At the mention of Lucy, the woman's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice tight. "Please," John said, his voice steady but pleading. "I know Sarah was running from something. I know you wanted custody of Lucy. I just need to understand why." The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, she opened the door wider, motioning for him to enter. John stepped into the dimly lit foyer, feeling an almost oppressive weight settle over him as he followed her into a small, sparsely furnished sitting room. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a worn armchair. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "If you want answers, then listen carefully. But understand, this is not a story that will make you feel better about any of this." John nodded, bracing himself. "Sarah was troubled," the woman began, her tone detached. "From a young age, she was difficult. Always running away, always afraid of things that weren't there. She was convinced someone was after her, that we were all conspiring against her. And when she had Lucy, it got worse. She was convinced that we wanted to take Lucy from her. Didn't you?" John interrupted, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. The woman's eyes hardened. "We wanted to help," she replied coolly. "Lucy was a sweet child, but Sarah was unstable. She refused our help, refused to even stay in one place. She kept running, claiming we were the threat. But you have to understand, Sarah was unwell." John clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his calm facade. "Or maybe she was right to be afraid," he said, his voice low. "Maybe she was protecting Lucy from you." The woman's gaze flickered, a brief crack in her composed mask. "You know nothing," she replied, her voice cold as ice. "You think you knew her, but you didn't see what she became." Her fear drove her mad. She left Lucy to fend for herself, dragging that poor girl through shelters and on the run, filling her with stories of people who wanted to hurt her. We would have given Lucy a stable life, but Sarah wouldn't allow it. She let her own paranoia destroy her. John felt a surge of rage, but he forced himself to stay calm. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Maybe Sarah wasn't the one who destroyed her life," he said quietly. "Maybe she was running because she was right to be afraid." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. He could see the faintest flicker of guilt in her expression, a brief flash of doubt that she quickly suppressed. Without another word, she rose, signaling that the conversation was over. John stood, anger boiling inside him as he walked to the door. But as he left, he turned back, looking her straight in the eyes. "I'm going to take care of Lucy," he said firmly. "She'll never have to run again." The woman's face was unreadable as she closed the door, leaving him alone on the front steps. He walked back to his car, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. Sarah's family had been after Lucy, but why? What were they hiding that had terrified Sarah enough to go on the run? As he drove away, John felt a new determination take hold. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would protect Lucy from whatever shadows lay in her past, just as Sarah had tried to do. And he would find out the truth, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of Sarah's life. By the time he returned to the shelter, it was late. Lucy was waiting for him, her face lighting up when she saw him, a mixture of relief and hope in her eyes. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice small. John knelt down, looking her in the eyes, his voice soft but firm. "I found some things, Lucy, but I promise you, whatever we find, we're in this together. You're safe now. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, her eyes shining with a trust he knew he couldn't break. Holding her hand tightly, he led her out of the shelter, feeling the weight of their journey ahead but knowing that, for Lucy's sake, he would see it through to the end. In the weeks that followed, John and Lucy began to rebuild their lives, weaving small moments of trust and stability into each day. The weight of the secrets surrounding Sarah's past lingered between them, but John tried to focus on giving Lucy a sense of normalcy, a life free from the fear and instability that had haunted her for so long. John kept his promise to be there for her. Every morning, he made her breakfast, even if it was something as simple as toast with jam and scrambled eggs. He waited for her after school, asking about her day, listening intently as she recounted each small victory and every challenge she faced. He took her to a nearby community center where she joined a youth soccer team, and he cheered from the sidelines, watching as her confidence grew with every game, her laughter echoing through the field. Slowly, he saw Lucy's walls come down, her reserved nature giving way to the bright, curious spirit that had been buried beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. But no matter how much progress they made, John knew that Lucy still wrestled with the questions that haunted her. Her mother's absence, the unanswered mysteries surrounding her past. They were questions too big for a child, burdens that should never have been hers to carry. And he could see that, despite her best efforts, those unanswered questions left a wound that even his love couldn't fully heal. One quiet evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie, Lucy turned to him, her face lit only by the glow of the television. "John," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think my mom, do you think she loved me?" The question hit him hard, more than he expected. He paused the movie, turning to face her fully, his expression serious and gentle. "Lucy, of course she loved you. She loved you so much that she sacrificed everything to keep you safe." Lucy looked down, her fingers picking at a loose thread on the couch cushion. "I don't remember a lot," she admitted, her voice wavering. "Sometimes, I think maybe she left because of me, because I wasn't enough to make her stay." John's heart ached as he reached out, placing a comforting hand over hers. "Lucy, you were her whole world. I know she left because she thought it was the only way to protect you. Whatever danger she feared, whatever shadows she was running from, she believed that leaving was the only way to keep you safe. It was never about you not being enough." She glanced up at him, her eyes brimming with uncertainty and longing. "But if she loved me that much, why didn't she tell me? Why did she leave without explaining anything?" John took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I think sometimes people make decisions they believe are right, even if they don't make sense to others. She was probably afraid that if she told you everything, you'd live with the same fear she felt. Maybe she thought that by keeping it from you, she was giving you a chance to have a normal life." Lucy nodded slowly, as if weighing his words, her expression thoughtful but still tinged with doubt. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I want to believe that she did it for me." "And I believe she did," John replied gently. "I've seen how strong and resilient you are, Lucy. That's not something that just happens. You got that from her." Lucy managed a small, grateful smile, the kind that told John his words had reached her, even if only a little. She shifted closer, leaning her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the television filling the room. But even as they shared this quiet moment, John knew that Lucy's journey toward understanding her mother's choices was far from over. She was still grappling with the weight of her mother's absence, the hollow ache of abandonment that no amount of reassurance could fully mend. And as much as he wished he could give her all the answers, he knew that the truth was a delicate balance, one that could either bring her peace or reopen wounds too painful to bear. The next day, as they walked through the park on a sunny afternoon, Lucy spoke up again, her voice tentative but steady. "John, do you think we'll ever find out the truth? About why my mom ran? About the people she was afraid of?" John stopped, looking down at her with a seriousness that mirrored her own. "I don't know, Lucy, but what I do know is that I'll be here every step of the way. We'll face whatever comes together." Lucy nodded, a hint of relief in her expression, and as they walked side by side, John realized that, for the first time, Lucy wasn't walking with that same tension in her shoulders. She was no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty alone. That evening, they sat down together and opened Sarah's old box, the one that held the remnants of her past. It was a small box, but each item inside was a piece of her mother's life. A photo, an old bracelet, scraps of paper with hastily written notes. Together, they examined each item, talking through each memory, each fragment, trying to piece together the story Sarah had never told. They spent hours that night, going through every detail, until Lucy's eyes grew heavy with sleep. John tucked her into bed, brushing a stray hair from her forehead as she drifted off. As he watched her sleep, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a love so fierce it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't known about her for most of her life, but now that he did, he knew he would go to any length to protect her. Over the following days, Lucy seemed lighter, her laughter more frequent, her trust in John deepening. They continued their quiet routines, living in a small bubble of newfound stability, both of them holding on to the hope that, one day, they would have all the answers they needed. And in the meantime, they had each other, an anchor in the midst of uncertainty. Yet, in the back of John's mind, he knew that the past had a way of surfacing, especially when it was buried beneath secrets and fear. And as much as he wanted to shield Lucy from whatever darkness lay ahead, he knew that when the time came, they would face it together, with the strength they had found in each other. For now, they would continue building their life, one step at a time, creating new memories to fill the void of the ones they had lost. And as John sat by her bedside, watching her sleep, he knew he had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: a family, a purpose, and a love that would guide him through whatever was yet to come. The day of reckoning arrived in the most ordinary way. John and Lucy had spent the afternoon together at the park, playing soccer and laughing as if the weight of their past had finally lifted. The autumn air was crisp, and Lucy's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with joy that, to John, was more precious than anything he could imagine. They had come so far together, he thought, and he felt an immense pride in the small world they had built, the trust, the laughter, the quiet routines that had become a new kind of family. As they made their way back home, John noticed a figure waiting by his front door. His heart stilled, dread curling at the edges of his thoughts as he recognized her. The woman from Sarah's family, the one who had refused him answers just weeks earlier. She stood there, her face set in a cold expression, her gaze locked on him with an intensity that made the hair on his neck rise. "Lucy," he said softly, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, "why don't you go inside? Sweetheart? I'll be there in just a minute." Lucy looked up at him, her expression uncertain, but she nodded, squeezing his hand before slipping inside, casting a cautious glance back at the woman on the doorstep. John watched until the door closed behind her, then turned to face the woman, his jaw set, his gaze steady. "You have no right to be here," he said, his voice low and firm. The woman's lips curled in a slight, humorless smile. "And yet here I am. I came to talk about Lucy. We haven't forgotten about her, you know? My family. We never wanted it to come to this, but she is still blood." John felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Lucy is my daughter," he replied evenly, "and Sarah did everything she could to protect her from you. She ran for a reason." The woman's gaze hardened, a flash of something dangerous in her eyes. Sarah was a troubled girl, too paranoid to see reason. She raised Lucy on fear, running from shadows, dragging that poor child through shelters and hiding her away like a fugitive. Lucy deserves stability, a real family. She deserves better than the ghost of Sarah's paranoia haunting her life. John felt his fists clench, anger searing through him. The only ghost haunting Lucy's life is the pain she's carried from being abandoned and feeling alone. She deserves a family, yes, but one that loves her, one that understands what Sarah sacrificed to keep her safe. And that's not your family. The woman's face tightened, her composure slipping. "We can give her opportunities you never could. We can give her a life where she doesn't have to be afraid." "You mean a life where she's controlled, kept in a cage, just like Sarah feared?" John's voice was cold, filled with a determination he hadn't known he was capable of. "Lucy is not just your family's pawn. She's her own person, and I will protect her from anyone who tries to manipulate her, anyone who dares to hurt her." For a moment, the woman seemed to falter, but then her expression hardened again, her voice dripping with disdain. "Sarah's fear turned you into a fool. You're so blinded by her memory that you can't even see what's best for the child." John took a step forward, his voice a quiet force. "No, you're the ones blinded by control and power, by the need to own her. Lucy deserves freedom, a life without the shadows of your family's grasp. I won't let you near her." The woman's eyes glinted with a final, bitter resentment, but she seemed to understand that John's resolve was unbreakable. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the silence as she disappeared down the street. John stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, feeling a fierce sense of relief and pride in the boundaries he had set. This family had haunted Sarah and Lucy for years, but he was determined to end their influence once and for all. He went inside, finding Lucy sitting on the couch, her face tense with worry. She looked up as he entered, searching his expression, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small. John knelt beside her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Lucy, you don't ever have to be afraid of them. I'm here, and I won't let them hurt you. You're safe now with me." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, and then, without a word, she threw her arms around him, holding him tight. John held her close, feeling the weight of years of separation, of lost moments and missed milestones, melt away in that one embrace. They stayed like that, bound together by the quiet strength of their connection, a strength that no outside force could touch. As the days passed, a new peace settled over their lives. John continued to give Lucy the stability she had never known, surrounding her with the warmth and love she had once thought impossible. And slowly, he watched her grow. Her laughter became more frequent, her silences less heavy. She began opening up about her dreams, talking about her future, about the things she wanted to do and become. She was no longer the girl who looked over her shoulder, haunted by fears she couldn't name. She was becoming a girl who looked forward, who felt safe enough to dream. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Lucy looked up at him, her face filled with a quiet resolve. "I want to remember her," she said softly. "I want to remember my mom, not as someone who left, but as someone who loved me. Someone who did what she had to, because she cared." John reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We can remember her that way, Lucy. We'll keep her memory alive in a way that honors the love she had for you. She was brave, just like you." Lucy nodded, her gaze steady. "I think she'd be happy now," she murmured. "Knowing that I'm safe." John felt his throat tighten, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I think she would be too. And I know she'd be proud of you. Proud of how strong you are, how brave and kind you've become." As they sat together, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their home, John realized that the journey they had taken had not only brought them closer, it had given them both a family. They were no longer two strangers connected by a thread of the past. They were father and daughter, bound by love and resilience, by the strength to overcome loss and the courage to embrace the future. And as he looked at Lucy, he knew that they had found something unbreakable, a bond that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Together, they had conquered the ghosts of the past, reclaimed their lives, and built a new beginning that would honor both the memory of Sarah and the promise of the future they would create, side by side. In the years that followed, John and Lucy built a life that grew richer with each passing season, each memory made stronger by the love and trust they had worked so hard to earn. The home they shared became a place of warmth and laughter, walls lined with photos capturing milestones both small and momentous. Lucy's first school play, soccer games where John shouted himself hoarse from the sidelines, quiet evenings spent baking cookies or reading together. Their lives became a patchwork of shared moments, woven together with the resilience that had come from surviving so much loss. Lucy grew into a young woman with a brightness that lit up every room. She excelled in school, her intelligence matched only by a kindness that endeared her to friends and teachers alike. She carried within her the quiet strength of her mother and the steady loyalty of her father, traits that made her wise beyond her years. She never forgot the pain of her early years, nor the sacrifices her mother had made. But those memories no longer haunted her. Instead, they fueled her, made her grateful for the life she had and determined to make the most of it. One day, as Lucy prepared to leave for college, a prestigious school where she had earned a full scholarship, she and John sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The weight of the moment hung between them, both of them knowing that this was a new chapter, a time for Lucy to take her first steps toward independence. John's heart swelled with pride, even as he felt the bittersweet ache of letting her go. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice warm but slightly unsteady. Lucy looked at him, her eyes soft with affection. "I am," she replied, "and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. For everything you did for me, for how you loved me when I didn't even know how to be loved." John swallowed, emotions welling up as he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserved every bit of that love, Lucy, and you always will." They sat in silence for a moment, the years of hardship and healing passing between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Finally, Lucy reached into her bag and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, her mother's journal, one of the few possessions she'd kept from Sarah. She handed it to John, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's time for you to read this," she said softly. "I've read it so many times, trying to understand her, but I think maybe you'll find something in there that I didn't." John took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of its pages, the memories held within. Over the years, Lucy had shared pieces of it with him, fragments of her mother's thoughts, words of love and fear and hope. But he had never held it himself, never looked at the words Sarah had written in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts and dreams. He opened it, the pages filled with her familiar handwriting, each line a glimpse into the woman he had once loved and lost. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, John sat by the fire, the journal open on his lap. As he read, he felt the ghost of Sarah's presence, her words flowing into him like whispers from the past. She wrote of her love for Lucy, her fears, her determination to keep her daughter safe at any cost. She wrote about him, too, her Johnny, the man she had loved fiercely, the one she had left to protect them both. And in her final entry, written just days before she disappeared, she had penned a message that struck him to his core. "If you ever read this, know that I loved you both more than words can hold. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. I hope that one day you'll understand, and that Lucy will find the family I could never give her. If there's a part of me left in this world, let it be in the love you carry forward." Tears blurred his vision as he closed the journal, the weight of Sarah's sacrifice settling over him like a quiet benediction. She had been brave, and though she had left a world of pain behind, she had also left something precious, her daughter, a girl who had grown into a beacon of hope, a living testament to the love they had once shared. In the years that followed, John and Lucy never let go of Sarah's memory, keeping her spirit alive in quiet ways. On Lucy's college graduation day, they visited Sarah's old town, leaving a bouquet of lilies by the lake where John and Sarah had spent countless hours talking about the future. They stood together, John and Lucy, their hearts full of gratitude and peace, honoring the woman who had given them both the courage to heal, to forgive, and to love. Eventually, Lucy went on to build her own life, a career dedicated to helping children who had endured hardship, a calling inspired by her own experiences and the resilience her father had nurtured in her. John, too, found a new purpose, using his own journey to mentor others who had lost their way, offering the kind of guidance he wished he'd had when his world had once felt shattered. And though their paths sometimes diverged, Lucy and John never lost the bond that had brought them together. Each holiday, every birthday and quiet Sunday morning, they returned to each other, a reminder of the family they had become. Their story was one of love reclaimed, of wounds healed through loyalty and forgiveness, a legacy of resilience that transcended loss. In the end, John understood that while life had taken Sarah from him, it had also given him something precious, a daughter, a love that grew beyond the confines of blood and past mistakes. And as he watched Lucy flourish, as he witnessed her create her own life filled with joy and meaning, He knew that he had fulfilled Sarah's final wish. Their journey had come full circle, a testament to the strength of the heart's quiet endurance. And as John looked toward the future, he knew that the love he carried forward was not just his own. It was Sarah's, Lucy's, and his, woven together into something eternal, something no shadow of the past could ever diminish.